They say she lost her slipper at midnight. But what they don't say is what she lost before that. Not the carriage, not the gown. Something deeper, older, something that has echoed in human blood for 6,000 years. This isn't a love story. This is a ritual, a contract, a cleansing by fire, and the world has been retelling it for millennia without ever asking why. Think carefully. Why is the girl nameless? Why is her past erased? Why must she be chosen only when unrecognizable? And what is it about midnight that makes everything collapse? Cinderella is not just a tale of escape. It is an encoded spell, one that has run through nearly every empire on earth, from ancient Sumer to your mother's bedtime whispers. You were told it was harmless. A harmless fairy tale. But what if the slipper was a symbol? What if the ashes she rises from are not metaphor, but sacrifice? Tonight, I'm going to show you something forbidden, not just the origin of this tale, but the ritual inside it. The same ritual that priests, kings, and shadow governments have used to erase the identities of the masses and rebuild them in their image. And here's the part that should scare you. It worked. You've lived it. You've walked through it, step by step, and you didn't even notice. That is the power of myth when used as a weapon. It doesn't just hide the truth. It programs the soul. You think you've been making choices, but the story chose you. From the moment they told you Cinderella was about finding a prince, the trap was already sprung. Because this isn't about royalty. It's about ritual initiation. Ashes, obedience, transformation, midnight, and at the center of it all a forgotten goddess. Banished, buried, but not gone. She's still there, watching through glass, smiling through mirrors, waiting for you to remember her name. So sit down. Clear your mind. And if you thought you were the hero of your own story, you're about to discover who really wrote it. Let's burn down the castle of illusions. You were told Cinderella was about kindness, hope, and dreams coming true, but the oldest versions tell a far darker truth, one soaked in blood, ash, and ancient obedience. Before glass slippers and fairy mothers, she was called Rhodope in ancient Greece, Ishan in ancient China, Ashempodel in Germany, and in every version, she doesn't just lose a shoe, she loses herself. Because the ritual isn't about love, it's about erasure. The name Cinderella, it isn't her name, it's her prison. It comes from the word cinders, ashes. She's stripped of her identity and renamed by force. Not by fate, but by design. And who renames her? The family, or so we're told. But in the oldest variants, they're not just cruel relatives. They are initiators. High priestesses of destruction, wearing the masks of mothers and sisters. They mock her, isolate her, strip her of honor. They are the fire she must walk through. This is not punishment. This is preparation. Across the ancient world, before any sacred transformation, came the death of the old self. In Babylon, temple slaves were renamed before service. In Egypt, initiates were buried alive in symbolic tombs, forgotten until rebirth. And in the Celtic rites of Beltane, the chosen walked through ash and flame to emerge as something else. Always ash, always transformation, always a new name. You think Cinderella was weak. You missed the point. She is undergoing the oldest rite in the world, death by identity. The old self is made invisible, silenced, covered in soot. Only then can the elite step in and offer a path out. A dress, a ride, a man. But what is that gown made of? And who really sent the coach? Here's the part they never told you. In some ancient versions, the helper isn't a fairy mother at all. It's the spirit of her dead mother, or a tree grown from her mother's grave, or a blood-soaked totem in the woods. In other words, not magic, ancestral power, the forbidden kind, the feminine kind, the kind that institutions have tried to destroy for 6,000 years. This isn't a bedtime story. This is a map of female spiritual power, coded, hidden, and passed down in whispers, until now. Now ask yourself, why the ball? Why must she go to a palace, not a temple, not a market, but a palace, and be judged by a prince she's never met? Because the palace isn't just a setting. It's a stage for submission. This is not love. It's vetting. An elite ritual of presentation, like the ancient rites where virgins were brought before kings, priests, or God to be chosen. In Mesopotamia, this was called the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage. A young girl chosen from the people, made divine by mating with a king. She doesn't choose him, he chooses her, and if she resists, she's erased. This ball is not a party. It's a spiritual transaction. Cinderella doesn't walk in with her own name, her own wealth, or her own will. She walks in manufactured, gowned, gilded, altered, her entire being reconstructed by external forces, and in that moment, she becomes desirable not for who she is, but for what she appears to be. This is grooming on a mythic scale. Think about it, she is invisible until she conforms, until the suit is scrubbed off, until her identity is replaced with luxury and silence. Only then does the system see her. Only then does the prince want her. But why does she have to leave at midnight? Why does everything collapse exactly at that hour? Because midnight is not random. It is the liminal space, the place between two worlds. In occult traditions, midnight is the witching hour. The veil thins. Time pauses. It's the moment between the old and the new, between death and rebirth. In Masonic and esoteric rites, initiates are often blindfolded, stripped, and led through darkness. Only in the final hour is light revealed, and only if they survive the inner death. That's what Cinderella is doing. She's walking between worlds. But here's the catch, she's not allowed to keep the power. The dress fades, the carriage dies, the spell ends. Because in this version of the world, power is on loan. And if she overstays her moment, the lie breaks, and her punishment returns. That's not magic, that's control. A ritual dressed as romance. A system that lets you touch freedom for a moment, then rips it away before you remember who you are. Let's talk about the slipper, the most iconic part of the story, and the most misunderstood. It's just a shoe, right? Wrong. It's a binding object, a symbol of proof, of control, of sexual and spiritual possession. But first, let's look deeper. In the French version by Charles Perrault, the one most of us grew up with, the slipper is made of glass. But many scholars now believe this was a mistranslation. The original term may have meant fur, a fur slipper, or in older oral traditions, a vulva symbol. An object not of elegance, but of raw, primal power. Now imagine that. The prince isn't chasing after a crystal fantasy. He's hunting something far older. A totemic relic of fertility, left behind like a sacred offering. Suddenly, the fairy tale shifts, because now the slipper isn't what proves her identity. It's what binds her to the system. It's not a gift. It's a claim. In ancient Chinese versions, the foot becomes a site of obsession. A remnant of foot binding culture where female submission was enforced through literal disfigurement. Tiny feet meant discipline, obedience, pain endured in silence. In Egyptian mythology, the slipper was a sacred item tied to Isis, the goddess of motherhood, rebirth, and sorcery. In some stories, it was said to be carried by birds to the pharaoh himself as a sign from the god. A signal that this woman, and no other, was to bear the divine hair. Sound familiar? The prince doesn't fall in love. He follows the object, and the object doesn't care who wears it as long as the ritual is fulfilled. This is not romantic destiny. It's selective possession. An elite-claiming tool disguised as love. Because what does the prince do once he has the slipper? He doesn't ask who she is. He doesn't listen to her voice. He silences every other woman. He forces the shoe onto every foot, no matter the pain, until the object obeys and reveals its owner. That's not love. That's a search for perfect compliance. And the moment it fits, the girl doesn't get her freedom. She gets sealed in a role forever. Bride, queen, silent consort of the regime. You still think she won. Now we come to the part no one dares to question, the happily ever after. The palace, the prince, the throne. The girl who was once covered in ash now wears a crown, and everyone cheers. The system worked. The ritual is complete. But pause. Really pause. Because if you understand ancient initiation, you know this is the final trap. In every mystery cult, the initiate is broken down, rebuilt, and then glorified. Not for their freedom, but for their usefulness to the order. Look closer. Cinderella doesn't rise on her own terms. She rises because she fits the mold. She conforms. She submits. She earns her reward through silence and survival. And what is her reward? A throne beside a stranger who never knew her name. A life inside the same palace that once saw her as worthless. This isn't triumph. It's assimilation. Now she wears the dress forever. She never returns to the ashes. She never questions the ritual. Because to do so are taught to envy her, to dream of the palace, to crave the approval of a system that first erased them. And boys, they're taught to be the prince, but not a sovereign warrior king, a programmed seeker, chasing the ideal woman based on a shoe. No real knowing, no shared pain, just a hunt for perfection, obedience, silence, beauty. This is not a story, it's a blueprint, a weaponized narrative repeated in cartoons, toys, pop music, wedding vows, over and over and over again. And every time it plays, another identity is shaped, another mind is chained. Another soul is led to believe this is what victory looks like. But true power doesn't come from a throne. It comes from remembering who you were before they named you. Before the ball. Before the slipper. Before the fire. And if you're still watching this, you're already starting to wake up. Let's return to the beginning. Not the palace. Not the ball. But the ashes. Where she lived. What she cleaned. What she was forced to become. Cinderella's home isn't a home. It's a ritual chamber. Dark, isolated, stripped of warmth, status, even name. Ashes in myth are never neutral. They are the byproduct of sacrifice. What's left after the offering is consumed. In ancient Vedic fire rituals, the ashes were sacred, but only because they meant something had died. So when you hear, Cinderella lived in ashes, read it clearly, she was being ritually erased. This isn't fiction. This is what elite systems do. It's what cults do. It's what intelligence agencies do. And it's what ancient priesthoods mastered long before history began. Isolation, deprivation, control, transformation. It's called identity breakdown. And it works. Lock someone in a symbolic grave. Strip their comforts, strip their past, strip their name. Flood them with humiliation. Then offer them a single, shining path of escape. But only if they comply. Sound familiar? Because the deeper you go into Cinderella's world, the clearer it becomes. This isn't just a family being cruel. It's systemic ritual abuse wearing the mask of household conflict. The stepsisters, they're the enforcers. Mocking her, repeating lies until she internalizes them. Reinforcing the caste, controlling the mirror. And the stepmother. In occult terms, she's the high priestess of control. She maintains the hierarchy, keeps the girl in the dust, manages the ritual pace until the initiate is fully broken. This isn't just about power, it's about ritual inversion. Take the divine feminine, once worshipped in ancient cults. Reduce her to a servant. Make her clean, scrub, obey. Make her forget that she was ever a daughter of the stars. And when the moment is right, offer her a golden key, but only to a deeper cage. Because Cinderella doesn't climb out. She is led out. By forces that appear benevolent, but exist only to rebrand the ritual as salvation. What you're seeing is a control loop, the same loop used in ancient temples, used in elite grooming networks, and used on you. If you're ready to break it, comment now, twice, to lock in the transformation. I remember the ashes. I remember the ashes, because until you do, you're still dancing to a song someone else wrote. They call her the fairy mother. A sweet, sparkling old woman with a wand and a smile, appearing out of nowhere, saying all the right things, making dreams come true. But ask yourself, really ask, who is she? Where does she come from? Why is she cloaked in light, but surrounded by rules? Why does her magic expire at midnight? Why does she help but never free? You were told she's an angel, but in the older versions of the tale, before Disney, before Perrault, she wasn't an angel. She was a grave spirit, a bloodline protector, a witch, not in the cartoon sense, in the priestess of the dead sense. In Grimm's Ashemputtel, the girl doesn't meet a fairy. She prays at her mother's grave, and from the earth grows a tree, which grants her what she needs, not with a wand but with birds, white doves, feeding her, clothing her, watching her from above. This is animism, not fantasy. This is ancestral ritual, not cartoon whimsy. The idea that dead mothers still protect, that the earth itself answers, that power doesn't come from outside institutions, but from within the bloodline. That's dangerous knowledge. That's the kind of truth they had to bury. So they recast her, softened her, made her sparkle, gave her a clock. Because the real fairy mother, the ancient feminine archetype, was never meant to be whimsical. She was meant to be remembered. She's the midwife of rebirth, the witch at the threshold, the shadow mother who grants power, but only to those willing to walk through death. She doesn't just give dresses. She bestows weapons. The gown isn't fabric. It's ritual armor. The shoes aren't accessories. They're seals of binding, or of breaking. And her time limit, midnight, that's not a curfew. It's a warning. Because real power isn't meant to be worn before initiation completes. If you wear the gown too long, without earning it, it burns you from the inside. That's why it fades. That's why it dies. Because the girl hasn't yet faced the final trial, the confrontation of the self. The fairy mother isn't there to rescue. She's there to test. You think the ball is a party? No, the ball is a grooming arena, an elite showcase, a psychological theater, a spiritual stage where the initiate is paraded like cattle, under gold chandeliers and ritual music, her soul still trembling from the fire she just crawled out of. And now, for one night only, she's masked, dressed, desirable. But she's not free. She's on display. The ball, in fairy tales, in royal history, in modern black tie galas, is not for the crowd. It's for the selector, the king, the prince, the silent architect of the game. She does not come as herself. She comes as the system allows her to be. Altered, refined, repackaged, and every eye watches not to admire, but to judge. Do you think this is fantasy? Look at the history of monarchies. Look at child brides chosen from poor bloodlines, elevated for beauty, silenced for compliance. Look at how rulers sought pure lineage and used rituals like this to harvest obedience disguised as favor. This isn't a dance. It's a final test of assimilation. In occult terms, the ball represents the false paradise. In esoteric circles, it's called the glamour gate, a temporary illusion where the initiate is allowed to taste power, but only as a guest, not as an owner. The dance, the eyes, the clock, all part of the enchantment. Because the deeper programming happens here, this is where the girl feels chosen. Not forced, not broken, chosen. She believes the lie because it's beautiful. And that is how control is perfected, not by chains, but by giving the prisoner a taste of luxury. You think the elite don't know this? Every system of psychological control, cults, cartels, intelligence handlers, uses the reward room. After isolation comes the indulgence. After suffering comes pleasure. Not to heal you, but to make you grateful to your captor. The ball is the siren song of the machine. It says, forget who you were. Forget the ashes. Look, now you sparkle. Now you belong. But there's one catch. You only belong until the clock strikes 12. And when it does, you're not just losing your dress. You're losing the illusion that you were ever free. Midnight. They told you it was just the time when the magic ends. But they lied. Midnight is the crack in the veil, the liminal gate, the line between one world and another, and every ancient system knew it. In the Eleusinian mysteries, initiates were led blindfolded through dark caverns until they emerged at midnight reborn. In Celtic Druid rites, the dead were said to speak again at the 12th hour. In Hermetic thought, midnight is when the material world and the astral world overlap. And in dreams, what happens at midnight? You either wake up, or you descend deeper. That's the choice. So when Cinderella runs at midnight, she's not escaping a party. She's fleeing the initiation she wasn't ready for. She hasn't yet remembered who she is. She's still wearing borrowed power, illusion made cloth, a name not hers, a purpose not chosen. And midnight won't tolerate that. Because midnight isn't gentle. Midnight reveals. That's why the dress fades. That's why the magic crumbles. That's why she's thrown back into the ashes. Because true power won't tolerate fakes. Not in the old world. Not in the hidden temples. And not in your soul. But here's the question no one asks. Why was she allowed to go at all? Why was the magic given to someone not ready? Because that's the trick. You are meant to fail the first time. You're meant to taste glory and lose it. You're meant to remember what it felt like to be seen, so you'll spend the rest of your life trying to feel it again. And the system will be waiting to sell it back to you. At a price. Fame, beauty, status, marriage, belonging. Every soul has its cost. But what if midnight wasn't the end of the magic? What if it was the real beginning? What if the moment she ran, barefoot, breathless, raw, was the first time she was ever truly herself? No spell, no dress, no permission, just the girl and the truth. And that, my friend, is where your story begins too. The stepsisters. They seem harmless, almost cartoonish, vain, petty, cruel. But they serve a purpose far darker than the story ever admits. They are not just bullies. They are mirrors. In every transformation ritual, the subject must confront fractured versions of themselves, aspects twisted by the system, reflections of who they might become if they submit to the lie. The stepsisters represent that lie. Look at them again. They are dressed in wealth, but not power. They mimic the elite, but have no substance. They are obsessed with status, beauty, validation, but underneath they are hollow. In ancient Egyptian rites, before one could enter the afterlife, they had to stand before 42 judges. Each judge reflected a different sin, a different distortion of the soul, not to punish but to purify. The stepsisters are like that. They humiliate Cinderella not just to torment her, but to try to shape her. Be like us, they say with every glance, every insult. Deny your truth. Compete, beg. Destroy your own light to fit in our darkness. This is ritual mocking, a known phase in psychological conditioning. The subject is surrounded by manufactured peers, all programmed to reflect only what the handler wants them to see. It breaks the will, shatters the identity, until the only escape is compliance. But here's what they fear most: Cinderella never becomes them. Even in ashes, she remains herself. And that's the real threat. Because in ancient feminine mysteries, from Inanna's descent to the Greek rites of Persephone, the initiate is always surrounded by dark sisters. But if she survives without imitating them, she ascends. The stepsisters can't love, they can't evolve, they can't see. They are trapped in the surface world, forever chasing approval they'll never receive because they sold their souls for someone else's mirror. But the girl in ashes, she still has a soul. And that is why the prince never chooses them. Not because she's prettier, but because deep down, the system knows a woman who survives the fire and keeps her truth is dangerous. That's who you are, not what they say, not what they want. The mirror doesn't define you, you break the mirror. And now the wedding, the so-called reward, the fairy tale ending. But if you've made it this far, you already know nothing in this story is what it seems. Not the slipper, not the fairy, not the palace, and definitely not the marriage. Because in ancient systems, weddings were not personal. They were contracts, covenants, ritual bindings between bloodlines, between gods and mortals, between flesh and institution. Cinderella's royal marriage isn't about love. It's about sealing the transformation permanently. She no longer belongs to herself. She belongs to the crown. Look at history. Look at the forced unions of royal girls, the arranged marriages between ancient houses, the bridal rites that were anything but romantic. In Sumer, the sacred marriage was a fertility ritual between a priestess and a king, meant to bind heaven and earth. In Babylon, brides were offered at temples for ceremonial, first nights, to gods. In the Vatican's own archives, the records of political marriages read like prison transfers. Even today, celebrity weddings are orchestrated as symbolic mergers. Brands, power, money. The girl is no longer an individual, she is a symbol. Her story, her suffering, is monetized, mythologized, consumed. Think, the girl who once knelt in ashes now sits on a throne. But has anything changed? She still doesn't speak. She still doesn't act. She still waits to be chosen, saved, confirmed. That is not evolution. That is the illusion of power. It's the final mask placed on the sacrifice, and the world applauds, because the ritual has worked. The system has successfully transformed a soul, not into a sovereign, but into a servant in silk. The gown, the crown, the ceremony, they're not rewards. They're tools of containment. Ancient rites always ended in marriage for a reason. Because once the initiate is bound, they don't question. They don't wander. They don't break the spell. They've been written into the myth, a living sigil, repeating the story for the next generation. And that's what the system wants. Not awakening. Not rebellion. But replication. Unless she remembers. Unless she sees the truth behind the veil. Unless she reclaims her name. Not the one they gave her, but the one she buried long ago. Ashes. The word feels soft. Passive. A gentle end. But don't be fooled. In the oldest mythologies, ashes meant something terrifying. They are what's left when a goddess is burned. When the sacred feminine is reduced to soot and silence. When fire, the cosmic purifier, is turned into a weapon of erasure. Cinderella sleeps in them, breathes them, wears them. They cling to her skin like a curse. But they're not a curse. They're a mark, a code, a ritual residue that identifies her as an initiate of something so old most don't dare speak its name. In Vedic fire ceremonies, the ash from burnt offerings is pressed onto the forehead, a spiritual seal. In African Ifa tradition, the sacred ash suiyaku is used to call down spirits and mark the threshold of transformation. In ancient Greece, ashes from sacrifice were mixed into potions meant to commune with the gods. But there's a darker use. Ashes also mark the erased, the burned, the forgotten. In the witch trials of Europe, women were reduced to ash to remove their memory from the earth. And this is the tension. Because in Cinderella, we don't just see a girl in dirt. We see a divine archetype smothered. She's not just covered in ashes. She is the ash, the living memory of something that was set on fire and survived. And now we ask, who lit that fire? The family. The system. The world that couldn't stand the power she held before she even spoke. Because here's the truth. Every ancient society feared the unbound feminine. Not the passive girl, not the obedient bride, but the wild one, the intuitive one, the one who could see without being told what to see. So they ritualized her, trained her, buried her in dust. And when that wasn't enough, they burned her. That's what the ashes remember. The feminine wasn't born weak. She was made to forget. But Cinderella doesn't stay in the ash forever. Because buried in that suit is spark, and the moment she recognizes what the fire tried to erase, she becomes more than a survivor. She becomes the flame, the glass slipper, delicate, transparent, precise. But let's drop the fairy tale lens, because in every ancient rite, the most dangerous objects are always the most beautiful. The slipper isn't just a shoe, it's a binding artifact. Let me explain. Across the ancient world, shoes, sandals, and feet carried enormous symbolic weight. In Egyptian tombs, sandals were buried beside kings to walk them into the afterlife. In Hindu temples, the feet of the divine were worshipped, traced, and replicated. In medieval covenants, one removed a shoe to seal a vow. The foot is sacred, and what covers it? A symbol of ownership. The glass slipper is no gift, it's a contract. Notice how it fits no one else, only her. Because it was never made for a person, it was made for a bloodline. This is biometric sorcery. Ancient priest, kings knew the body could be encoded with ritual measurements. The golden ratio, the divine cubit, the perfect step. To fit the slipper meant you carried the mark. It wasn't about beauty. It was about eligibility. She doesn't win because she's pretty. She wins because she was chosen by the algorithm of the throne. The slipper is how the system verifies identity, and it's made of glass for a reason. Glass is fragile, yes, but also revealing. You can't hide in a glass shoe. It shows every contour, every flaw. It's surveillance, and it's purity. To wear it is to be exposed and to be claimed. That's why the prince doesn't remember her face, but obsesses over the shoe. Because this isn't about love. It's about verification. He's not looking for a woman. He's looking for a match, a vessel, a specific spiritual geometry that can sit beside the crown without corrupting the code. And ask yourself, why does she leave it behind? Because part of her wants to escape the contract. She knows the moment she's found, it's over. The mask becomes skin. The girl becomes symbol. The spell becomes law. The slipper tracks her, binds her, finds her. In occult terms, it's a sigil, a tracking device made holy by ritual use. Once she wears it again, the rite completes, and her fate is sealed. Unless she chooses to break the glass. The prince. You think he's a savior, a romantic hero, the perfect match. But in the shadow of this tale, the prince is something far darker. He is a gatekeeper, a living archetype of order, a vessel of control. For thousands of years, kings and princes weren't just rulers. They were ritual centers, anchors for cosmic balance, conduits of divine authority. Their power came not from birthright alone, but from binding the feminine energy through sacred union. Marriage wasn't love, it was absorption. By marrying the chosen woman, the prince claimed her power, her bloodline, her spiritual essence. He didn't just take a bride, he took a living talisman. Her fire, her transformation, her magic. This was how dynasties secured their power, not by sword alone, but by spiritual symbiosis. But here's the catch, the prince's power depends on the woman's submission. Not obedience, but complete surrender of the true self, because only when the feminine is bound and silent can the masculine rule unchecked. This is why the prince is both prize and prison. He represents the system, the machine, the unyielding order that demands sacrifice for stability. Look closely, he never sees Cinderella as a person. She's an object, a code, a key, and the moment she truly wakes, sees through the illusion, she becomes dangerous. Because she's no longer a talisman to be owned, she becomes a force of chaos, a threat to the very order he embodies. This is the real reason the prince needs the glass slipper, not just to find her, but to contain her. To lock down the power that refuses to be tamed. The prince's kingdom is built on that binding, on controlling what cannot be controlled. But remember this, no fortress is impenetrable, no cage is eternal, and the girl who once spun straw into gold, she still holds the power to rewrite the story. Now, the secret, the 6,000-year-old ritual hidden inside Cinderella, whispered through millennia in coded stories and ancient rites. This isn't just a girl's tale. It's a blueprint for power transfer, a ceremonial passage that binds the individual soul to the ruling system. From Sumerian priestesses to Egyptian queens, from Babylonian consorts to European monarchs, the ritual remains the same. A girl from the margins, tested by fire and ash, given impossible tasks that strip her down to her core. Tempted by false glory, the ball, the dress, the dance. Hunted by shadows, the stepsisters, the prince, the clock. Marked by a token, the slipper, the ring, the name. And finally, the bonding marriage. But this ritual is no mere tradition. It's a psychological weapon. It breaks down the natural self and rebuilds it as a tool for control. A vessel to carry the will of the elite, the hidden hands that shape history. Why? Because power, true power, cannot be given. It must be taken. It must be earned. Or more precisely, forced through symbolic surrender. The fairy tale hides this truth in plain sight. The burning ashes are the old self's death. The midnight flight is the narrow escape from illusion. The glass slipper is the binding contract. The prince is the gatekeeper of order, and the firstborn child the price paid. This ritual isn't just ancient myth. It's the DNA of institutional manipulation. It's the pattern repeated in secret societies, in elite bloodlines, in political marriages. It's how the invisible chains are forged soft, beautiful, seductive, and deadly. But here's what the story doesn't say. The ritual only holds power if you accept it. If you believe the mask is you. If you think the system owns your name. If you trade your freedom for fleeting favor. The girl in ashes. She has a choice. She can wear the crown, or she can break it. Because the greatest magic is remembering who you truly are, beyond the ball, beyond the mask, beyond the midnight hour. The power to spin your own destiny. The power to reclaim your true name. Now, repeat after me in the comments. I own my name. I own my power. Say it twice loud and clear. Seal your transformation. Unlock your freedom. Because once you know the ritual, the game changes, and the shadows can no longer hold you. That is the 6,000-year-old secret hidden inside Cinderella. Now, The question is, what will you do with it?